You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250, where we look at events that took place 250 years ago this week. This is part of the American Revolution podcast, but it's just a short bonus episode to remind you about important anniversaries from the Revolutionary War. This week, we remember Daniel Boone, who began work on the Wilderness Road this week in 1775. In early March 1775, Daniel Boone began work on behalf of a land speculator named Richard Henderson. Boone's job was to cut a road from existing frontier settlements in Tennessee, near present-day Kingsport, into Kentucky territory. This later became known as the Wilderness Road. He used the Cumberland Gap in the Appalachian Mountains to reach the Kentucky River. Now, I don't know about you, but I tend to think about Daniel Boone more as a frontiersman than as part of the Revolutionary War. Of course, Boone was involved in both. His earliest connection to this era was his work in the Braddock Campaign, where he and his cousin, Daniel Morgan, worked as teamsters. This was that big event that began the French and Indian War, where George Washington was a colonel, General Gage was an officer. There were a whole bunch of other Americans who later became generals who were also involved in this campaign, and Daniel Boone was a part of that. Boone lived almost his entire life on the frontier, working as a hunter, trapper, surveyor, and guide. The road he was building in 1775 followed a route that he had traveled as early as 1769 as part of his efforts to find a route into the Kentucky Territory, where he spent several years. But Boone was also part of the colonial world. He served as a militia captain in Lord Dunmore's War against the Indians in 1774, and he continued to serve on the Patriot side as a militia officer during the Revolutionary War itself, although he never did serve in the Continental Army. Boone was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates. When the British invaded Richmond in 1781, they took Boone prisoner, but quickly gave him parole. Boone frequently had encounters with Indians, who killed or captured several of his children. Boone himself was once captured, but managed to escape. He led militia against the Indians at the Battle of Blue Lick in 1782, near the end of the war, and he lost another son in that battle. But we're here today to talk about Boone's establishment of the Wilderness Road in 1775. It marked a path that would be used by thousands of future settlers moving west. Richard Henderson, the head of the Transylvania Company, had established the group that purchased all of what is today eastern Kentucky from the Cherokee and Iroquois tribes in what became known as the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals. I discussed this in episode 102 of the American Revolution podcast. Boone's entry into Kentucky helped kick off an all-out war with the Cherokee, which was, of course, encouraged by British Indian agents, which were trying to make life more difficult for the rebels. Boone's Wilderness Road was little more than a path, but it was designed to provide a guide for settlers to follow into Kentucky, so that they did not just, end up wandering through the wilderness. The road itself was not even designed for wagons. It was more for men on horseback or walking. Boone's team included axemen to cut down trees in order to establish the road. The biggest hurdle for those traversing the West, of course, was getting through the Appalachian Mountains. The Wilderness Road used the Cumberland Gap, which ended up proving one of the best ways to get through the mountain chains. It's estimated that over 10,000 people used the Wilderness Road to enter Kentucky before the end of the Revolutionary War. Over the next decade, that number grew to over 100,000. By that time, Kentucky had a sufficient population to become the 15th state in 1792. Boone opened a small frontier store after the war. It lasted for a few years, but Boone really wasn't a businessman. His store went bankrupt a few years after that, leaving him in debt, and he moved further into the wilderness to avoid being served with an arrest warrant for his debts. Boone eventually received a land grant from the Spanish governor at Louisiana, giving him a plantation along the Missouri River in what is today the state of Missouri. After the U.S. took control of that land as part of the Louisiana Purchase, Boone lost his land grant. He appealed to Congress for the land based on his past services to the country, and after a 5-year fight, Congress eventually granted him title to the land. Boone would die in Missouri in 1820. although 25 years later, his bones were dug up and moved to Kentucky at the request of the state legislature. I hope you've enjoyed our look at Daniel Boone and the Wilderness Road. If you want to learn more about these incidences, please follow the American Revolution podcast. Once again, thank you for joining us.